Welcome, fellow travelers of the night, to a journey through the mist-shrouded stone walls and weathered corridors of medieval monasteries. Before we begin our descent into this world of prayer and penance, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what draws you to these ancient halls of devotion. Whether you're settling into bed in New York, watching the sunrise in Tokyo, or finding a quiet moment somewhere in between, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time exploring the shadows of the past. If you find comfort in these nocturnal wanderings through history, consider subscribing so we can continue these journeys together into the forgotten corners of medieval life. Now, close your eyes and imagine stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a Benedictine monastery in the year 1200. The air is thick with incense and the musty scent of ancient stone. Candlelight flickers against granite walls, casting dancing shadows that seem to whisper of centuries of devotion and suffering. This is a world unto itself, cut off from the chaos of medieval society, yet harboring its own unique forms of brutality and hardship. Tonight, we'll walk in the sandaled footsteps of monks who chose to abandon the world in pursuit of divine grace, only to discover that their earthly trials had just begun. We'll witness the crushing weight of religious discipline, the gnawing hunger of perpetual fasting, and the psychological torment of absolute silence that could drive even the most devout soul to the brink of madness. The monastery bell tolls in the darkness, calling the brothers to matins at 2 a.m. It's a sound that has echoed across these walls for generations, marking not just the hours of prayer, but the relentless rhythm of a life dedicated to spiritual warfare against the flesh, the world, and the devil himself. Picture Brother Thomas, a young novice who entered these walls barely 6 months ago. His family, minor nobility from the countryside, sent him here as a third son, with no inheritance prospects. The romantic notions he harbored about monastic life have long since crumbled, like the ancient mortar between these stones. His stomach aches from the meager diet of bread, thin gruel, and watered wine. His knees are raw from countless hours kneeling on cold stone floors. His back aches from the endless labor in the monastery's fields and workshops, but the physical hardships pale compared to the mental anguish. The rule of Saint Benedict governs every moment of his existence with iron discipline. Speaking is forbidden, except during designated hours and only about matters of absolute necessity. The silence is not peaceful meditation, but a suffocating blanket that weighs upon the soul. Thoughts echo endlessly in the chambers of the mind, with no outlet for expression, no human connection to ease the burden of solitude. The monastery operates on a schedule that would break the strongest peasant. Sleep is a luxury rationed in 4-hour intervals. The monks rise at 2 for matins, pray until dawn, then begin their daily labors. There are 7 canonical hours of prayer throughout the day, each requiring absolute attendance regardless of illness, exhaustion, or personal crisis. Prime at sunrise, terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3, vespers at sunset, and finally compline before the brief respite of sleep. Between these prayers, the monks toil in brutal conditions. Some tend the monastery's vast agricultural holdings, working fields with primitive tools under the scorching sun or freezing rain. Others labor in scriptoriums, hunched over manuscripts for hours, until their eyes blur and their hands cramp into claws. The fortunate few work in workshops, crafting goods to sell or trade. But even these seemingly gentler tasks involve long hours of repetitive motion that leaves bodies twisted and joints inflamed. Food is both scarce and deliberately unappetizing. The rule prescribes that meals should sustain life but never bring pleasure. Meat is forbidden except for the gravely ill. The daily fare consists of coarse bread, often mouldy from poor storage, thin vegetable broth, and weak ale that barely qualifies as nourishment. During the frequent fasting periods, even these meager rations are reduced to near starvation levels. Many monks develop the gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance of the chronically malnourished. The clothing provides little comfort or protection. Each monk possesses only 2 rough woolen habits, often crawling with lice and fleas. In winter, the unheated stone buildings become ice chambers where breath forms clouds and inkwells freeze solid. Chilblains and frostbite are common ailments. In summer, the heavy wall becomes a suffocating prison that breeds rashes and infections. Medical care is primitive and often more harmful than the ailments it attempts to treat. The monastery's infirmarian relies on bloodletting, herbal remedies of dubious value, and prayers to saints for healing. Serious injuries or illnesses often result in slow, agonizing deaths. The monastery cemetery fills steadily with brothers who succumb to diseases that would be easily treatable in our modern world. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of monastic life is the complete surrender of personal autonomy. Every decision, from what to eat, to when to sleep, to how to spend each moment, is dictated by the rule and enforced by the abbot with absolute authority. Questioning this system is not merely discouraged, but punished as a sin against God himself. The penalty for serious infractions can include public flogging, solitary confinement on bread and water, or expulsion into a world that no longer has a place for fallen monks. The psychological pressure of this existence breaks many minds. Some monks develop what we might recognize today as severe depression, spending their days in catatonic silence, broken only by involuntary weeping. Others experience religious mania, claiming visions and divine communications that border on the hallucinatory. A few suffer complete mental collapse, requiring restraint to prevent them from harming themselves or others. Consider Brother Marcus, a monk of 20 years whose devotion gradually transformed into obsession. He began seeing demons in every shadow, convinced that his fellow brothers were agents of Satan sent to test his faith. He stopped eating, believing that food was poisoned by evil spirits. Eventually, he had to be confined to a cell where he spent his final days scratching prayers into the stone walls with his fingernails until they bled, crying out warnings about the approaching apocalypse. The monastery's hierarchy creates its own forms of cruelty. The abbot, often appointed more for political connections than spiritual wisdom, wields power that would make feudal lords envious. Below him, various officials enforce discipline with zealous brutality. The cellarer controls all food distribution and can starve disobedient monks into submission. The master of novices breaks the spirits of new arrivals through systematic humiliation and punishment. Senior monks, twisted by years of suffering, often take sadistic pleasure in tormenting their juniors. Corporal punishment is not only accepted, but encouraged as a means of spiritual purification. Public flagellation occurs regularly, with monks taking turns whipping each other until blood flows freely. Private self-mortification is even more extreme, involving hair shirts embedded with metal spikes, chains that cut into flesh, and deliberate exposure to extreme temperatures. These practices are not seen as aberrations, but as holy disciplines that bring the practitioner closer to the sufferings of Christ. The isolation from the outside world creates its own torments. Monks receive no news of family members, cannot attend funerals or celebrations, and watch their former lives fade into distant memory. Many entered the monastery as children, given away by families who could not support them and know no other existence. Yet they often fantasize about the world beyond the walls, creating elaborate mental escapes that only make their confinement more unbearable. Sexual frustration compounds the misery. Young men in their physical prime are expected to maintain perfect celibacy while living in close quarters with no outlet for natural desires. The monastery's rigid segregation from women does nothing to diminish these urges, which are treated as demonic temptations requiring harsh penance. Some monks develop unhealthy obsessions or engage in behaviors that bring shame and severe punishment. The educational aspects of monastic life, often romanticized in modern accounts, were far from the scholarly paradise many imagine. Most monks remained functionally illiterate, capable only of recognizing familiar prayers by sight. The few who learned to read and write did so through brutal rote memorization, endless copying of texts they didn't understand, and severe beatings for any mistakes. The monastery library, if it existed at all, contained perhaps a few dozen books chained to desks and accessible only to senior monks. Intellectual curiosity was actively discouraged as a form of pride. Questions about theology, philosophy, or natural phenomena were treated as dangerous departures from accepted doctrine. The goal was not understanding, but obedience, not wisdom, but submission. Many brilliant minds withered in this environment, their potential contributions to human knowledge lost forever in the pursuit of mindless compliance. The monastery's economic operations often resembled a medieval sweatshop more than a holy community. Monks laboured to produce goods for sale in markets, with profits flowing to the abbot and monastery officials rather than improving conditions for the workers. Agricultural work involved backbreaking labour from dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons. Craft production required meeting quotas under constant supervision, with punishment for any perceived laziness or incompetence. Seasonal variations brought their own challenges. Winter meant working in conditions so cold that tools would stick to frozen hands. Summer brought suffocating heat in the workshops and fields where water was rationed and rest periods minimal. Spring planting and autumn harvest demanded 16-hour workdays that left monks collapsing from exhaustion. The monastery's relations with the outside world created additional pressures. Powerful nobles and church officials expected lavish hospitality when they visited, requiring monks to prepare elaborate feasts they themselves could not enjoy. Political conflicts often embroiled monasteries in dangerous intrigues, with abbots forced to choose sides in wars and succession disputes. Economic pressures from tithes, taxes, and tribute payments meant that resources were constantly squeezed, leaving monks to bear the burden of institutional poverty. Disease outbreaks were particularly devastating in the closed environment of a monastery. When plague, typhoid, or other epidemic diseases entered these walls, they spread rapidly through the crowded dormitories and shared facilities. The primitive sanitation and lack of medical knowledge meant that mortality rates could reach 50% or higher during severe outbreaks. Survivors often emerged weakened and traumatized, having watched their brothers die in agony while powerless to help. The spiritual crisis that many monks experienced was perhaps the cruelest torture of all. After years of sacrifice, suffering, and devotion, many found themselves feeling abandoned by the God they had given everything to serve. Prayers seemed to echo unanswered in empty chapels. The promised spiritual consolations never materialized. Instead of divine peace, they found only doubt, despair, and a growing suspicion that their sacrifices had been meaningless. Some monks developed what we might recognize as scrupulosity, an obsessive fear of sin that made every thought and action a source of torment. They confessed imaginary transgressions, performed endless penances for non-existent failures, and lived in constant terror of divine punishment. Others swung to the opposite extreme, embracing a fatalistic nihilism that saw all religious observance as empty ritual performed by hypocrites for a non-existent deity. The monastery's attempts to maintain discipline often revealed the fundamental contradictions in its mission. Institutions dedicated to love and compassion employed torture and brutality to maintain order. Communities founded on spiritual brotherhood festered with jealousy, hatred, and petty tyrannies. The pursuit of heavenly perfection created earthly hells that destroyed far more souls than they saved. Yet perhaps most tragic of all were the monks who genuinely believed in their calling and found their faith slowly eroded by the realities of monastic life. These men entered with pure hearts and noble intentions, only to discover that the institution they had trusted to nurture their souls, was systematically destroying their humanity. They watched themselves become bitter, cruel, and spiritually dead while maintaining the external facade of holiness. As we near the end of our journey through these shadowed halls, consider the broader implications of this monastic brutality. These were not isolated incidents of abuse, but systematic features of medieval religious life. The very structure of monasticism, with its emphasis on absolute obedience, self-denial, and separation from the world, created conditions ripe for exploitation and cruelty. The monks who endured these hardships were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. Most were children given away by families, younger sons with no inheritance prospects, or adults fleeing desperate circumstances in the outside world. Once within the monastery walls, escape was nearly impossible. Leaving meant excommunication, social ostracism, and often death from exposure or starvation. The psychological damage inflicted by this system extended far beyond the monastery walls. Former monks who somehow managed to leave often remained broken for life, unable to form normal relationships or function in secular society. Their traumatic experiences created ripple effects that touched families and communities for generations. As the monastery bell tolls one final time in our imagination, calling the brothers to their last prayer of the day, we can only marvel at the human capacity for both inflicting and enduring suffering in the name of the divine. These men believed they were purchasing salvation through their agony, trading earthly comfort for eternal reward. Whether that bargain was worth the price they paid remains one of history's most haunting questions. The shadows deepen in the monastery corridors as our journey comes to an end. The candles gutter out one by one, leaving only darkness and the whispered echoes of centuries of prayer, pain, and unfulfilled longing for a peace that seemed always just beyond reach. In the morning, the bells will ring again, and the brutal cycle will continue as it has for generations, grinding human spirits into dust beneath the weight of absolute devotion to an increasingly distant God. Part 2. The cruel machinery of monastic discipline. While the physical hardships of medieval monastic life were enough to break most men, they paled in comparison to the psychological torment that awaited those who dared to transgress against the ironclad rules of the monastery. For beneath the veneer of holy purpose and divine calling lay a machinery of discipline so brutal, so systematically designed to crush the human spirit, that it would make even the most hardened medieval lord pause in horror. The rule of Saint Benedict, that sacred text which governed every waking moment of monastic existence, was not merely a guide for spiritual living. It was a weapon, wielded with surgical precision by abbots and priors who understood that true obedience could only be achieved through the complete annihilation of individual will. Every gesture, every word, every thought was scrutinized, measured against an impossible standard of perfection that no mortal soul could hope to achieve. Brother Thomas of Whitby, a young monk who entered the monastery with dreams of serving God, discovered this harsh reality within his first month behind those stone walls. His crime was simple, almost laughably minor by today's standards. He had dared to speak during the sacred hours of silence, asking a fellow brother where he might find additional parchment for his copying work. Such a transgression, however innocent, could not go unpunished in a world where silence was not merely preferred, but commanded by divine authority. The punishment that followed was swift and merciless. Thomas was stripped of his robes and forced to prostrate himself naked before the entire community during the evening meal. As his brothers ate their meagre portions of bread and thin soup, Thomas lay face down on the cold stone floor, his body trembling not just from the chill, but from the crushing weight of public humiliation. The abbot stood over him, reciting his sins in a voice that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like the pronouncement of eternal damnation. But the humiliation was only the beginning. He was forbidden from speaking, from making eye contact with his fellow monks, from participating in communal prayers. He ate alone, slept alone, worked alone, existing as a ghost among the living. When he attempted to ask for guidance on his daily tasks, he was met with blank stares and turned backs. The psychological isolation was so complete, so devastating, that by the third day, Thomas began to question his own sanity. This was no accident. The architects of monastic discipline understood with chilling clarity that the human mind, deprived of social connection and meaningful communication, would begin to fracture. They had observed that men subjected to prolonged silence would start to hear voices, see visions, experience hallucinations that could be conveniently attributed to either divine revelation or demonic possession, depending on the monastery's needs. The discipline extended far beyond mere silence. Medieval monasteries employed a sophisticated system of physical punishments that would have impressed the most creative torturers of the age. The scourge was a constant companion, a leather whip tipped with small metal barbs that was used not just for self-flagellation, but as a tool of correction administered by superiors. Monks were expected to receive these beatings with gratitude, thanking their tormentors for helping to purify their souls through the redemptive power of pain. Brother Marcus, a former nobleman who had joined the monastery seeking refuge from political enemies, learned this lesson the hard way when he was caught hoarding a small piece of cheese from the evening meal. His punishment was to receive 50 lashes across his bare back while reciting the Pater Noster. With each strike of the whip, as the metal barbs tore through his flesh and blood began to flow down his spine, Marcus was required to thank God for the privilege of suffering. Any sign of resistance, any cry of pain that wasn't immediately followed by an expression of gratitude would result in additional lashes. The psychological manipulation inherent in this system was diabolical in its effectiveness. By forcing the victim to participate in their own torment, to express gratitude for their suffering, the monastery broke down the natural human instinct for self-preservation. Men learned to police their own thoughts, to anticipate punishment before it was even administered, to confess to sins they hadn't committed rather than risk the discovery of transgressions they had. The confessional became another instrument of terror, a place where monks were required to bear not just their actions, but their most private thoughts and desires. The abbot and his designated confessors were masters of psychological manipulation, skilled at extracting admissions of guilt through a combination of theological intimidation and implied threats. They understood that every human being harbored secret shames, private doubts, moments of weakness that could be weaponized against them. Brother Francis, a young man who had shown promise as a scholar, found himself trapped in this web when he confessed to having impure thoughts about a village woman he had seen during a rare trip outside the monastery walls. What should have been a simple matter of penance became a months-long ordeal of psychological torture. The confessor, Father Benedict, began to probe deeper, asking for increasingly specific details about these thoughts, demanding that Francis describe exactly what he had imagined doing with this woman. Each confession session became more intrusive, more humiliating than the last. Father Benedict would force Francis to kneel for hours while describing his fantasies in graphic detail, all under the guise of ensuring complete spiritual cleansing. The young monk began to realize that these sessions had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with the confessor's own twisted fascination with forbidden desires. But to refuse to answer, to question the process, would be to commit the ultimate sin of disobedience. The punishment for disobedience was exile to what the monastery euphemistically called the House of Correction, a windowless stone cell barely large enough for a man to lie down. Here, recalcitrant monks were left in complete darkness, fed nothing but bread and water, forced to contemplate their sins in an environment designed to induce madness. The walls wept with moisture, creating an atmosphere so damp and cold that men would develop lung infections within days. The only human contact came when guards delivered the daily ration of stale bread, and checked to ensure the prisoner was still breathing. Brother William, a former merchant who had questioned the monastery's practice of selling false relics to gullible pilgrims, spent 3 months in this hellhole. By the time he emerged, his hair had turned completely white. His body was racked with tremors, and he had developed a stutter that would plague him for the rest of his life. But more devastating than the physical toll was the psychological damage. William had been broken so completely that he became one of the monastery's most zealous enforcers, turning in fellow monks for the slightest infractions with the fervour of a true believer. This transformation was not uncommon. The monastery had perfected the art of creating what we might today recognise as Stockholm Syndrome, where victims develop an emotional bond with their captors. Monks who survived the worst punishments often became the most ruthless administrators of discipline, convinced that their suffering had purified them and made them worthy instruments of God's will. The daily routine itself was a form of torture, designed to wear down resistance through sheer monotony and exhaustion. The day began at 2 a.m. with the ringing of the bell for matins, the first of 8 prayer services that would punctuate every moment of waking life. Monks stumbled from their hard pallets, many still suffering from the previous day's punishments, their bodies aching from malnutrition and overwork. The chapel where they gathered for these services was deliberately kept cold, with no heating even in the depths of winter. Men stood for hours in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the frigid air, their feet numb with cold, reciting prayers in Latin that many of them barely understood. The repetitive nature of these services was hypnotic, designed to induce a trance-like state where critical thinking became impossible. Between prayer services, the monks were assigned to various labours that served not just the practical needs of the monastery, but the psychological goal of maintaining absolute control. The scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts, became a particular instrument of torment. Scribes were required to work in perfect silence, hunched over their desks for 12 hours at a time, their fingers cramped from gripping the quill, their eyes straining in the dim candlelight. Any mistake in copying was treated as a grave sin, requiring the monk to start the entire page over again. Brother Edmund, a talented scribe who had been educated at the cathedral school before joining the monastery, once made a single error in copying a psalm. He was forced to begin the entire book again, losing 3 months of painstaking work. The psychological impact of seeing his labour destroyed was devastating, but the message was clear. Perfection was expected, and anything less was an affront to God. The monastery's economic operations provided another avenue for exploitation and abuse. While the abbot and senior monks lived in relative comfort, the ordinary brothers were worked like slaves in the fields, workshops, and kitchens that generated the monastery's wealth. They laboured in the blazing sun during harvest time, their hands bleeding from handling the sharp-grained stalks, their backs bent from the endless repetition of gathering and threshing. In the monastery's brewery, monks worked in stifling heat and humidity, tending to the vats of fermenting ale that would be sold to pilgrims and local villagers. The irony was not lost on these men that they were forbidden from enjoying the fruits of their labour, allowed only the weakest small beer, while the profits from their work enriched the monastery's coffers. The kitchen was perhaps the cruelest workplace of all, where hungry monks were surrounded by food they could not eat, preparing meals for guests and visitors, while their own stomachs cramped with hunger. Brother Paul, assigned to kitchen duty during Lent, spent 6 weeks cooking elaborate feasts for wealthy pilgrims, while surviving on nothing but bread, water, and occasional vegetables. The smell of roasting meat, the sight of rich sauces and fine wines, became a form of exquisite torture for a man whose body was consuming itself from malnutrition. The monastery's relationship with the outside world revealed another layer of hypocrisy and abuse. While the monks themselves lived in enforced poverty, the institution accumulated vast wealth through donations, land holdings, and the sale of religious services. Wealthy nobles would pay enormous sums to have masses said for their deceased relatives, believing that the prayers of these holy men could reduce time in purgatory. The monks performing these services knew they were participating in what amounted to a confidence scheme, selling spiritual benefits they had no power to deliver. But to question this practice, to suggest that their prayers held no special power, would be to commit heresy punishable by excommunication or worse. So they continued to perform their roles in this elaborate theatre, their consciences slowly eroding under the weight of their complicity. The monastery's treatment of novices, young men who had not yet taken their final vows, was particularly cruel. These boys, some as young as 12 years old, were often given to the monastery by families who could not afford to feed them or who sought to curry favour with the church. They arrived with hopes of education, of finding purpose and meaning in religious life, only to discover they had been sold into a form of sanctified slavery. Novice Richard, the son of a poor farmer, entered the monastery at age 14 with dreams of becoming a scholar. Instead, he found himself assigned to the most menial tasks, cleaning latrines, scrubbing floors, carrying heavy loads that strained his developing muscles. When he dared to ask when he might begin his studies, he was beaten for presumption and told that humility must come before learning. The senior monks seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating these young novices, perhaps seeing in them reminders of their own lost innocence and abandoned dreams. They were subjected to training that was little more than systematic abuse, designed to break their spirits before they were old enough to resist or escape. The monastery's medical practices revealed yet another dimension of institutional cruelty. The infirmary, theoretically a place of healing and comfort, became another venue for suffering and exploitation. Sick monks were often denied adequate care, their illnesses attributed to spiritual failings rather than physical causes. The monastery's physician, usually a monk with minimal medical training, employed treatments that were as likely to harm as heal. Brother Lawrence, suffering from what we would now recognize as tuberculosis, was prescribed a regimen of bloodletting and purging that weakened him further. When his condition worsened, it was attributed to his lack of faith, and he was denied the pain-relieving herbs that grew in the monastery's own garden. He died in agony, coughing up blood while his fellow monks prayed over him, convinced that his suffering was somehow redemptive. The monastery's library, which should have been a source of knowledge and enlightenment, became another instrument of control and manipulation. Access to books was strictly regulated, with most monks forbidden from reading anything beyond their prayer books and assigned texts. The vast collection of classical works, philosophical treatises, and scientific manuscripts remained locked away, available only to the abbot and a few trusted scholars. This deliberate restriction of knowledge served multiple purposes. It prevented monks from encountering ideas that might challenge the monastery's authority, but it also created a form of intellectual starvation that left men desperate for any form of mental stimulation. When Brother Augustine was finally granted permission to read a work by Aristotle, after 5 years of pleading, he wept with gratitude despite knowing that this small privilege could be revoked at any moment for the slightest transgression. The monastery's justice system was a mockery of fairness, designed not to determine truth but to maintain order through fear. Accusations could be made anonymously. Evidence was often fabricated or coerced, and the accused had no right to defend themselves. The chapter house, where these proceedings took place, became a theatre of terror, where men's lives could be destroyed on the whim of their superiors. Brother Martin learned this when he was accused of stealing wine from the cellar, a charge based solely on the testimony of a monk who harboured a personal grudge against him. Despite his protestations of innocence, despite the lack of any physical evidence, Martin was found guilty and sentenced to 6 months of solitary confinement. The real thief, a monk favoured by the abbot, continued his crimes while Martin suffered for sins he had not committed. The psychological pressure of living under such a system drove many monks to the brink of madness. Some developed what we might now call paranoid disorders, constantly looking over their shoulders, afraid that any word or gesture might be misinterpreted as rebellion. Others retreated into catatonic states, becoming so passive and withdrawn that they seemed more like walking corpses than living men. Brother Gabriel, once a vibrant young man with a passion for music, gradually lost all capacity for joy or creativity under the monastery's oppressive regime. He stopped speaking unless directly addressed, stopped eating unless forced, stopped participating in any activity beyond the bare minimum required for survival. When concerned fellow monks tried to reach out to him, he would stare at them with empty eyes, as if he no longer remembered what it meant to be human. The monastery's treatment of death and dying revealed perhaps the ultimate cruelty of the system. When monks died, often from the very conditions imposed by monastic life, their deaths were celebrated as victories over the flesh, examples of holy sacrifice to be emulated by the survivors. The pain and suffering that preceded these deaths were reframed as spiritual purification, making it impossible for the living to acknowledge the very real injustices they witnessed daily. Brother Stephen, dying slowly from the effects of prolonged malnutrition and untreated disease, was held up as a model of holy suffering. As he wasted away, his fellow monks were required to visit his bedside and thank him for the inspiring example of his patient endurance. The young man's obvious agony, his desperate whispered pleas for relief, were ignored in favor of the narrative that cast his suffering as redemptive. Even in death, there was no escape from the monastery's control. The deceased monk's few possessions were distributed among his brothers, but only after being carefully examined for any evidence of forbidden items or unauthorized writings. Brother James, discovered to have hidden a small collection of pressed flowers from the monastery garden, was posthumously declared to have died in a state of sin, his body buried in unconsecrated ground as a final humiliation. The cumulative effect of all these practices was the creation of a community of broken men, their spirits crushed, their humanity systematically stripped away in the name of divine service. They moved through their daily routines like automatons, going through the motions of religious observance, while their souls slowly died within them. The monastery had succeeded in its goal of creating perfect obedience, but at the cost of everything that made its inhabitants recognizably human. As we witness this systematic destruction of human dignity and spirit, we begin to understand that medieval monastic life was not the peaceful retreat from worldly concerns that popular imagination suggests. It was instead a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological and physical abuse designed to break down individual identity and replace it with absolute submission to institutional authority. The monks who survived this process were not holy men purified by suffering, but damaged human beings, their capacity for independent thought and genuine compassion permanently impaired by years of systematic brutalization. The monastery stood as a monument to the darkest impulses of organized religion, a place where the promise of spiritual enlightenment was used to justify the most degrading forms of human exploitation. The monastery stood against the grey dawn sky like a fortress of suffering, its thick stone walls concealing horrors that would make even the most hardened warrior weep. Within those walls, men who had sought God found only endless torment, their days measured not in prayer, but in pain. The bells that rang across the countryside were not calls to worship, but death knells for the spirits of those trapped within. For the novice stepping through those heavy wooden doors for the first time, the monastery appeared as a sanctuary of peace and learning. The reality was far more sinister. What awaited him was not salvation, but a systematic destruction of his humanity that would continue until his dying breath. The rule of Saint Benedict, held sacred by these communities, was twisted into an instrument of oppression that turned holy men into broken shells of their former selves. Within hours of arrival, the new monk would discover the true nature of his chosen life. The first shock came with the food, if it could even be called that. What passed for meals in these monasteries would have been rejected by the poorest peasant. Thin gruel made from spoiled grains, mouldy bread crawling with weevorms, and water so contaminated it reeked of decay. The monks ate in silence, their hollow eyes reflecting years of malnutrition, their gaunt faces telling the story of countless meals that left them hungrier than when they began. The brothers responsible for preparing these meagre rations took a perverse pleasure in ensuring maximum suffering. They would deliberately allow food to rot before serving it, claiming that consuming putrid sustenance was a form of penance that brought one closer to God. The weak ale, their only beverage besides the fetid water, was often soured deliberately, causing violent stomach cramps and bloody flux that left monks doubled over in agony for days. Sleep, that basic human need, became another instrument of torture in the monastic routine. The dormitories were freezing stone chambers where dozens of men lay on straw pallets so thin they might as well have been sleeping on the bare floor. The straw was changed perhaps once a year, if at all, becoming a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and rats that would feast on the monks during the night. Many brothers bore the scars of countless rat bites, their bodies covered in infected wounds that never properly healed. But even this miserable excuse for rest was constantly interrupted. 7 times each day and night, the bells would summon the monks to prayer regardless of illness, exhaustion, or weather. The night officers were particularly brutal, forcing men from their beds in the dead of winter to stand for hours in unheated chapels, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they recited endless psalms with voices cracked from cold and fatigue. The chapel itself was a monument to suffering. During the long winter months, ice would form on the interior walls, and monks would frequently collapse from hypothermia during the extended services. Those who fell were left where they lay until the prayers concluded, their fellow brothers forbidden from offering assistance, lest they be accused of placing human compassion above divine obedience. The work assigned to the monks was designed not to sustain the community, but to break their bodies and spirits. Brothers were sent to labor in fields during the harshest weather, their thin robes providing no protection against driving rain or bitter wind. They worked with primitive tools, often with their bare hands, until their fingers bled and their backs bent permanently from the strain. In the scriptorium, monks hunched over manuscripts for 16 hours at a time, their eyes straining in dim candlelight until many went blind. The ink they used was often mixed with their own blood when supplies ran low, and mistakes in copying were punished with brutal beatings. The illuminated manuscripts that emerged from these monasteries were indeed beautiful, but each golden letter represented hours of agony and suffering by the men who created them. The workshops where monks crafted goods for the outside world were little better than torture chambers. Blacksmiths worked without proper protection, their arms and faces scarred by burns from the forge. Weavers labored until their fingers were raw and bleeding, producing fine cloth while dressed in rags themselves. Carpenters used tools so crude and worn that accidents were inevitable, and many monks bore the evidence of missing fingers or permanent injuries from their enforced labor. Perhaps most insidious was the way the monastery's hierarchy used confession as a weapon of psychological warfare. What should have been a source of spiritual comfort became a tool for extracting secrets and maintaining control. The abbot and his inner circle would use the confessional to gather information about dissent, doubt, or any sign of independent thought among the brothers. During these confessions, monks were encouraged to report on their fellow brothers, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that poisoned any possibility of genuine fellowship. Those who confessed to having doubts about their vocation or questions about church doctrine were subjected to special punishments designed to crush their spirits entirely. The punishments themselves were creative in their cruelty. Brothers might be forced to prostrate themselves naked on the cold stone floor of the chapel for hours while their fellow monks walked over them. Others were confined to tiny cells, barely large enough for a man to sit, left in complete darkness with no food or water for days. The most severe punishment was the hair shirt, a garment woven with sharp metal threads that cut into the skin with every movement, worn day and night until infection set in. For those who showed signs of mental breakdown, the monastery had special treatments that would have horrified even the secular world. Monks deemed to be possessed by demons of doubt or despair were subjected to exorcisms that involved beatings, starvation, and exposure to the elements. Many never recovered their sanity, spending their remaining years as hollow-eyed madmen who spoke only in whispers and jumped at shadows. The medical care provided to sick monks was perhaps the most revealing aspect of the monastery's true nature. The infirmary was a place where suffering was prolonged rather than relieved. The brother assigned as physician was typically the most sadistic member of the community, viewing illness as God's punishment that should not be alleviated too quickly. Treatments consisted primarily of bloodletting, performed with dirty instruments that spread infection rather than curing it. Monks with broken bones were often left to heal improperly, resulting in permanent deformities. Those suffering from diseases were isolated not to prevent contagion, but to allow them to die slowly and painfully, as examples to the others. The psychological toll of monastic life was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering. Men who had entered the monastery with genuine faith and hope for spiritual growth found themselves trapped in a system that systematically destroyed everything they held sacred. The constant surveillance, the arbitrary punishments, and the deliberate humiliation designed to break their will created a population of broken men who existed rather than lived. Many monks developed what we might now recognize as severe mental illness. Some became catatonic, staring blankly at walls for hours without speaking or moving. Others developed obsessive behaviors, repeating prayers or gestures thousands of times each day in a desperate attempt to find some measure of control in their powerless existence. The suicide rate among monks was carefully hidden from the outside world, but the monastery graveyards told the real story. Young men who should have lived for decades died mysteriously in their cells, their deaths attributed to sudden illness but whispered about as self-inflicted escapes from unbearable suffering. Those who attempted to leave the monastery faced the most severe punishments of all. The vows they had taken were considered binding unto death, and any attempt to break them was seen as the ultimate betrayal. Monks who tried to escape were hunted down by the abbot's men and returned to face public floggings that often proved fatal. Even more tragic were those who succeeded in escaping, but found themselves so damaged by their experiences that they could not function in the outside world. Years of systematic abuse had left them unable to make decisions, form relationships, or even care for their basic needs. Many became beggars or hermits, living out their days as broken shadows of the men they had once been. The corruption within the monastic hierarchy was absolute and without shame. While the common monks starved, the abbot and his favourites feasted on rich foods and fine wines. They wore silk robes beneath their rough outer garments and slept on feather beds in heated chambers. The very men who preached about the virtue of poverty lived in luxury built on the suffering of their subordinates. These corrupt leaders used their positions to enrich themselves and their families, selling the products of the monks' labour while keeping the profits for themselves. They formed alliances with local nobles and wealthy merchants, providing them with favourable treatment in exchange for gold and political protection. The sexual abuse that occurred within these institutions was another horror carefully concealed from the outside world. Young novices were particularly vulnerable, often selected for their beauty rather than their piety. The vow of celibacy became a cruel joke as those in power used their authority to satisfy their lusts while threatening their victims with eternal damnation if they spoke of what they endured. The systematic destruction of learning and knowledge was perhaps one of the monastery's greatest crimes. While the outside world believed these institutions were centers of education and preservation of ancient wisdom, the reality was far different. Books were destroyed if they contained ideas deemed dangerous by the abbot, and monks were forbidden from reading anything beyond approved religious texts. The libraries that did exist were carefully guarded, accessible only to the inner circle, who used their monopoly on knowledge to maintain their power. Monks who showed too much intellectual curiosity were punished severely, their desire to learn treated as a form of pride that needed to be crushed. The copying of manuscripts was done not to preserve knowledge for future generations, but to create valuable commodities that could be sold to wealthy patrons. The monks who did this work were kept ignorant of what they copied, forbidden from reading the texts they so carefully reproduced. As the years passed, the monastery became a machine for producing broken men who had long forgotten why they had originally sought the religious life. The bright-eyed young men who entered seeking God emerged, if they survived at all, as hollow shells who moved through their daily routines like automatons. The prayer that had once brought them comfort became a meaningless recitation of words that held no spiritual significance. The work that was supposed to bring them closer to the divine became mere drudgery, performed without thought or feeling. The community that should have supported them became a collection of strangers who viewed each other with suspicion and fear. The monastery's influence extended beyond its walls, poisoning the surrounding community with its corruption and cruelty. Local families were pressured to send their sons to the monastery, often as a form of taxation or tribute to maintain peace with the powerful abbot. These young men became sacrifices to a system that devoured their lives and souls. The monastery also served as a tool of political oppression, providing the ruling class with a convenient way to dispose of inconvenient individuals. Political prisoners, younger sons of nobles who might challenge their elder brother's inheritance, and anyone who questioned the established order could find themselves forced into monastic life against their will. The economic exploitation was equally systematic and ruthless. The monastery's vast lands were worked by peasants, who received nothing in return but the promise of salvation in the afterlife. The monks themselves became overseers of this exploitation, their humanity so thoroughly destroyed that they felt no compassion for the suffering they helped to perpetuate. The products created by the monastery's workshops were sold at enormous profits, with none of the wealth returning to benefit either the monks who created them or the peasants who provided the raw materials. The monastery became a machine for extracting wealth from the surrounding region and concentrating it in the hands of a few corrupt leaders. Even death provided no escape from the monastery's cruelty. Dying monks were denied comfort or pain relief, told that their suffering was God's will and that any attempt to ease it would endanger their souls. They died alone, in pain, surrounded by brothers who had been so thoroughly brutalized that they could no longer feel human compassion. The bodies of dead monks were often disposed of with shocking disregard for human dignity. Mass graves were common, with dozens of bodies thrown together without ceremony or individual recognition. The monastery's records deliberately obscured the true number of deaths, presenting a false picture of the institution's mortality rate to the outside world. The monastery's treatment of mental illness revealed perhaps the deepest level of its institutional cruelty. Monks who suffered breakdowns were not seen as men in need of care, but as examples of spiritual weakness that threatened the community's reputation. They were hidden away in cells deep within the monastery's foundations, forgotten by the world above. These unfortunate men lived their final years in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for animals. Fed scraps of food barely sufficient to sustain life, they existed in their own filth until disease or despair finally claimed them. Their cries for help went unheeded, dismissed as the ravings of men possessed by demons. The systematic destruction of family bonds was another tool used by the monastery to maintain control over its inhabitants. Monks were forbidden from communicating with their families, and any letters or messages from the outside world were destroyed unread. This isolation was designed to make the monastery the only reality the monks knew, eliminating any hope of rescue or escape. When family members attempted to visit, they were turned away, with stories of their loved ones' spiritual progress that bore no resemblance to reality. The monastery's public face was carefully maintained through these deceptions, presenting an image of holy men devoted to prayer and learning while concealing the truth of their systematic destruction. The corruption extended to every aspect of monastic life, turning even the most sacred rituals into instruments of oppression. The Mass became a performance designed to impress visitors and donors, rather than a genuine expression of faith. The sacraments were used as rewards and punishments, with monks being denied communion or confession based on their compliance with the abbot's wishes. The monastery's relationship with the broader church hierarchy was built on mutual deception and shared corruption. Visiting bishops were shown carefully staged demonstrations of monastic life, while the reality was hidden away until the inspectors departed. These officials, often corrupt themselves, were easily satisfied with the bribes and gifts that accompanied their visits. The true horror of the medieval monastery lay not in any single act of cruelty, but in the systematic and deliberate destruction of human dignity and spiritual hope. It was an institution that took men seeking God and transformed them into broken slaves, using the language of faith to justify the most heinous abuses imaginable. The monks who survived their ordeal carried the scars for the rest of their lives, their spirits so thoroughly crushed that many never recovered their capacity for joy, love, or hope. They had sought salvation and found only damnation, pursued holiness and discovered only corruption, reached for heaven and been dragged down into a hell of human creation. The monastery stood as a monument to the depths of human cruelty, a place where the most sacred ideals of faith and community were perverted into instruments of torture and oppression. The monastery gates opened each dawn like the jaws of a hungry beast, swallowing another day's worth of suffering and despair. Beyond those iron bars lay a world that the outside believed was filled with holy devotion and peaceful contemplation. But for those trapped within the stone walls of medieval monasteries, reality painted a far more sinister picture. The monastic life, supposedly dedicated to serving God and finding spiritual enlightenment, had devolved into something far more twisted and cruel than the secular world could imagine. As we've already witnessed, the medieval monastery was a machine designed to break the human spirit through systematic brutality. The rigid schedules, starvation diets, enforced silence, and savage punishments were just the beginning of a comprehensive system of oppression that sought to transform living, breathing human beings into hollow shells of obedience. But the darkness ran even deeper than the surface cruelties we've explored. The very architecture of these religious fortresses was designed to reinforce the inmates' powerlessness. Towering stone walls blocked out the natural world, while narrow windows filtered only slivers of sunlight into the perpetually dim corridors. The claustrophobic cells, barely large enough for a single person to lie down, served as concrete reminders of how little space a monk's individual existence was permitted to occupy. Every aspect of the physical environment conspired to make the inhabitants feel small, trapped, and utterly dependent on their superiors. The psychological warfare waged within monastery walls was perhaps even more devastating than the physical torments. Monks were deliberately isolated from their families and former lives, cut off from any source of identity or support outside the monastery's control. Letters from home were intercepted and often destroyed, while visits from relatives were either forbidden entirely or heavily supervised and restricted. This systematic severing of external bonds ensured that the monastery became the monk's entire universe, making escape seem not just impossible, but literally unthinkable. The confessional system, supposedly designed to cleanse the soul, became instead a tool of manipulation and psychological control. Monks were required to confess not only their actions, but their thoughts, dreams, and even fleeting emotions to their superiors. These confessions were then weaponized against them, creating detailed psychological profiles that could be used to exploit their deepest fears and insecurities. One who admitted to doubts about his faith could face months of solitary confinement and forced fasting. The corruption within the monastic hierarchy created a grotesque parody of Christian virtue. While ordinary monks starved on thin gruel and mouldy bread, abbots and priors feasted on rich meats, fine wines, and exotic delicacies imported from distant lands. These supposed spiritual leaders accumulated vast personal wealth through the monastery's holdings, living in luxurious private quarters while their subordinates shivered in bare stone cells. Many high-ranking monks kept mistresses in nearby villages, fathering children they would never acknowledge while preaching celibacy to their followers. The recruitment practices of medieval monasteries revealed their predatory nature. Young boys, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old, were handed over to monasteries by families who could no longer afford to feed them or who sought to curry favour with the church. These children, known as oblates, had no choice in their fate and were immediately subjected to the full brutality of monastic life. Many never survived to adulthood, succumbing to malnutrition, disease, or the psychological trauma of their captivity. Those who did survive often emerged as broken adults, incapable of functioning in the outside world and completely dependent on the institution that had destroyed their childhood. The monastery's relationship with the surrounding community was one of parasitic exploitation rather than spiritual service. Through a combination of religious manipulation and outright intimidation, monasteries extracted enormous wealth from the peasantry in the form of tithes, donations, and bequests. Families were convinced to hand over their life savings to ensure their loved ones' passage to heaven, while the monasteries used this wealth to expand their temporal power and influence. The monks themselves, supposedly dedicated to poverty and humility, became some of the wealthiest landowners in medieval Europe. Medical care within monasteries was a nightmare of ignorance, superstition, and deliberate neglect. Sick monks were often told that their illness was a punishment from God for their sins, and were denied proper treatment as a form of spiritual purification. The monastery's infirmary, when it existed at all, was typically a place where monks went to die rather than to heal. Bloodletting, the application of leeches, and other barbaric practices were considered advanced medicine, while actual healing knowledge was suppressed as potentially heretical. The educational system within monasteries, while producing some learned individuals, was fundamentally designed to create obedient servants rather than independent thinkers. Monks were taught to read and write, but only so they could copy approved texts and perform administrative duties for their superiors. Any display of intellectual curiosity or original thinking was quickly crushed, as independent thought posed a threat to the rigid hierarchy. Libraries were locked away from ordinary monks, and access to knowledge was strictly controlled by the abbot and his inner circle. Perhaps most tragically, the monastery's mission of spiritual development was completely subverted by its emphasis on control and submission. Rather than fostering genuine religious experience or personal growth, the monastic system created an environment where fear and desperation masqueraded as devotion. Monks learned to mouth the words of prayer while their hearts remained empty, going through the motions of worship while their spirits withered away. The very institution that claimed to bring men closer to God instead drove them into spiritual darkness and despair. The daily routine of prayer, rather than providing comfort or meaning, became another form of torture. Hours upon hours of repetitive chanting in cold, drafty chapels left monks physically exhausted and mentally numb. The Latin words they recited were often incomprehensible to them, reducing prayer to meaningless syllables uttered in desperate hope of avoiding punishment. Many monks reported feeling completely disconnected from any sense of the divine, experiencing their religious duties as an endless burden rather than a source of spiritual nourishment. The sexual repression enforced within monasteries created its own special category of suffering and corruption. Young men forced into celibacy without choice or preparation often developed severe psychological problems, including depression, anxiety, and various forms of sexual dysfunction. The unnatural suppression of normal human desires led to widespread abuse, both of power and of persons. Older monks preyed upon younger ones, while the strict prohibition against discussing such matters ensured that victims had no recourse for help or healing. The economic exploitation of monastic labor was staggering in its scope and brutality. Monks worked from dawn to dusk in the monastery's fields, workshops, and scriptoriums, producing goods and wealth that they would never see or benefit from. Their unpaid labor subsidized the lavish lifestyles of the monastic elite, while they themselves lived in conditions that would be considered inhumane for livestock. The fruits of their toil were sold in markets across Europe, generating enormous profits that disappeared into the private coffers of abbots and bishops. The judicial system within monasteries was a mockery of justice, where accusations could be made anonymously and punishments handed down without any form of due process. Monks could be condemned to years of solitary confinement, brutal physical punishment, or even death based on nothing more than the word of a superior or the testimony of a fellow monk seeking to curry favor with the authorities. There was no appeal process, no representation, and no protection against false accusations. The psychological profile of those who thrived in this system reveals the moral bankruptcy at its core. The monks who rose to positions of power were typically those most willing to abandon their humanity in service of the institution. They were masters of manipulation, capable of presenting a facade of holiness while engaging in the most depraved behavior behind closed doors. These individuals understood that the monastery's true purpose was not spiritual development, but the accumulation and exercise of power over others. As night fell over the monastery, casting long shadows through the stone corridors, the true horror of this medieval institution became most apparent. In the darkness, away from any outside scrutiny, the worst abuses took place. Young novices disappeared into the private chambers of their superiors, their cries muffled by the thick stone walls. Monks who had shown signs of rebellion were dragged to hidden chambers where they faced tortures that would make the Spanish Inquisition proud. The monastery's reputation for holiness provided perfect cover for acts of depravity that would shock even the most jaded observer. The few who managed to escape this hellish existence often found themselves completely unable to function in the outside world. Years of institutional control and abuse had left them incapable of making independent decisions or forming normal human relationships. Many became beggars or hermits, forever marked by their experiences within the monastery walls. Others returned voluntarily to the institution that had destroyed them, unable to conceive of any other form of existence. The legacy of these medieval monasteries extended far beyond their own walls, poisoning the very concept of religious life for generations to come. The corruption, abuse, and hypocrisy that flourished within these institutions would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation and the widespread rejection of institutional Christianity. The damage done to countless individual lives was immeasurable, creating ripple effects that would be felt for centuries. Yet perhaps the most damning aspect of the medieval monastery was how successfully it concealed its true nature from the outside world. Through careful manipulation of information, strategic displays of charity, and the cultivation of powerful political allies, these institutions maintained their reputation as centers of holiness and learning. The very people they were exploiting and destroying continued to support them financially and socially, unaware of the horrors taking place behind the monastery walls. The medieval monastery stands as one of history's most successful examples of institutional evil disguised as virtue. It took the highest aspirations of human spirituality and twisted them into instruments of oppression and control. In the name of serving God, these institutions served only themselves, creating a system so thoroughly corrupt that it poisoned everything it touched. The suffering endured by countless thousands of monks across medieval Europe represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of organized religion, a reminder of how easily noble ideals can be perverted in service of power and greed. As we reflect on these horrors from our modern perspective, we must remember that they were not aberrations or isolated incidents, but the inevitable result of a system designed to break the human spirit in service of institutional power. Part 5. The Psychology of Control and Indoctrination. The psychological warfare waged within monastery walls went far beyond mere physical punishment or material deprivation. The medieval church had perfected a system of mental conditioning that would make modern dictatorships envious, systematically breaking down individual identity and rebuilding it in service to the institution. This was not accidental brutality, but calculated psychological manipulation designed to create perfect compliance through the complete destruction of personal autonomy. From the moment a novice entered the monastery, every aspect of their mental landscape was carefully monitored and molded. The monastic schedule itself was a tool of psychological control, with its relentless rhythm of prayers, work, and study, leaving no time for independent thought or reflection. The constant interruption of sleep for midnight prayers served a dual purpose. It demonstrated absolute obedience to God's will, while simultaneously creating a state of chronic fatigue that made critical thinking nearly impossible. Sleep deprivation, as any modern interrogator knows, is one of the most effective methods of breaking down psychological resistance. The monks were subjected to what we would now recognize as classic techniques of thought control. Their every conversation was monitored by appointed brothers who reported any hint of dissent or questioning to the abbots. Private friendships were forbidden as potential sources of alternative loyalty. The practice of mutual surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia where no monk could trust another, ensuring that any rebellious thoughts remained isolated and powerless. Brothers were encouraged to report even the smallest infractions of their fellows, creating a network of informants that would have impressed the secret police of any totalitarian regime. The confessional system became perhaps the most insidious tool of psychological manipulation. What was presented as spiritual cleansing was actually a systematic method of extracting information about the inner lives of the monks. Every doubt, every moment of anger or frustration, every fleeting sexual thought had to be confessed in excruciating detail. The abbot and his designated confessors built detailed psychological profiles of each monk, identifying their weaknesses, fears, and pressure points. This information was then used to customize punishments and manipulations to maximum effect. The most psychologically damaging aspect of monastic life was the deliberate cultivation of learned helplessness. Monks were taught that they were inherently sinful, weak, and incapable of making correct decisions without constant guidance from their superiors. Every natural human impulse was labeled as temptation from the devil. Sexual desire, the need for companionship, intellectual curiosity, even the basic desire for adequate food and warmth, were all characterized as spiritual failings that demonstrated the monk's fundamental unworthiness. This systematic destruction of self-esteem served multiple purposes. It made the monks completely dependent on the monastery for their sense of identity and worth. Without the structure and approval of their superiors, They were taught to believe they would inevitably fall into sin and damnation. This psychological dependency was so complete that many monks who attempted to leave the monastery voluntarily returned, unable to function in the outside world after years of having their decision-making capacity systematically undermined. The monastery employed sophisticated techniques of emotional manipulation that would be familiar to anyone who has studied cult psychology. Love bombing was used selectively, with senior monks occasionally showing unexpected kindness or approval to younger brothers who showed signs of particular obedience or usefulness. This intermittent reinforcement created powerful psychological bonds, as the starved monks became desperately grateful for even the smallest crumbs of human warmth. Conversely, withdrawal of approval and affection was used as punishment, creating intense anxiety and a desperate desire to regain favor. The education provided in monasteries was itself a form of indoctrination. While monks learned to read and write, their access to knowledge was carefully controlled and filtered. They were taught only what served the interests of the church, with entire areas of human knowledge declared off-limits as dangerous or heretical. Classical philosophy was taught selectively, with inconvenient ideas censored or reinterpreted to support Christian doctrine. Scientific inquiry was discouraged except when it served religious purposes. History was rewritten to emphasize the glory of the church and the inevitability of Christian triumph. This was presented as a spiritual discipline, but functioned as a form of self-surveillance that would have made George Orwell's thought police proud. Monks were required to constantly monitor their own mental processes, identifying and condemning any thoughts that deviated from approved patterns. They learned to fear their own minds as sources of temptation and corruption, developing an internal critic that was often harsher than any external authority. The psychological impact of this constant self-monitoring was devastating. Many monks developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and depression. They became trapped in cycles of mental self-flagellation, constantly finding new sins and impurities to confess and punish. The natural human capacity for joy, creativity, and independent thought was systematically crushed under the weight of perpetual guilt and self-doubt. The monastery's control extended even to the monks' relationship with their own bodies. They were taught to view their physical forms as prisons for their souls, sources of temptation and corruption that had to be constantly subdued. Natural bodily functions became sources of shame and spiritual anxiety. The need for food, sleep, warmth, and human touch were all characterized as weaknesses to be overcome, rather than basic human requirements to be reasonably satisfied. This alienation from their own bodies made the monks more compliant with the harsh physical conditions of monastic life, while also making them easier to manipulate psychologically. A person who has been taught to distrust and despise their own physical sensations is much more likely to accept external authorities' definitions of what they should think and feel. The monks learned to override their natural survival instincts and emotional responses in favor of whatever their superiors demanded. The cumulative effect of these psychological pressures was the creation of individuals who had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they could no longer function as autonomous human beings. They had become, in effect, extensions of the institutional will, capable of carrying out orders without question or moral reflection. This was not an unfortunate side effect of monastic life, but its primary purpose: to create a class of perfectly obedient servants who would never challenge the authority or interests of the church hierarchy. The tragedy of this system was not just the individual suffering it caused, but the way it prevented the development of critical thinking and moral reasoning that might have led to genuine spiritual growth. Instead of creating wise and compassionate religious leaders, the monastery system produced broken men who could only perpetuate the cycle of abuse and control they had themselves endured. The very people who should have been sources of spiritual guidance and moral leadership had been systematically stripped of the psychological tools necessary for independent ethical judgment. The psychological manipulation employed in medieval monasteries represents one of history's most successful experiments in mass mind control. It created a system so effective at breaking human spirits that many of its techniques would later be adopted by secular totalitarian movements. The monastery had perfected the art of creating willing slaves who would not only accept their bondage, but actively participate in maintaining it, believing their suffering to be not only necessary but spiritually beneficial. This psychological dimension of monastic brutality was perhaps the most damaging of all, because unlike physical wounds, the damage to the human psyche could persist for a lifetime. The monks who survived their monastic experience often carried the scars of their psychological conditioning long after they left the monastery walls, unable to fully recover their capacity for independent thought and emotional freedom. They had been taught so thoroughly to distrust themselves that they could never fully embrace their own humanity again. The monastery's success in psychological control was so complete that many of its victims became its most enthusiastic defenders, unable to acknowledge the reality of their own abuse, even to themselves. They had been so thoroughly convinced of their own unworthiness and the righteousness of their suffering that they genuinely believed their tormentors were saving their souls. Looking at this brutal reality of medieval monastic life, let's delve deeper into the sinister mechanisms that made these institutions such effective machines of psychological destruction. The confessional system wasn't merely about spiritual guidance, it was a sophisticated intelligence network that turned monks into unwitting informants against themselves and their brothers. Every private thought, every moment of doubt, every human impulse had to be laid bare before the confessor, who meticulously catalogued these revelations. This created detailed psychological profiles that the hierarchy used to identify potential troublemakers, exploit personal weaknesses, and maintain absolute control. Monks lived in terror of their own minds, knowing that even thinking the wrong thought would be discovered and punished. The monastery's economic structure was perhaps its most cynical aspect. While monks took vows of poverty and scraped by on meagre rations, the institution accumulated vast wealth through their unpaid labor. Monasteries owned extensive lands, operated profitable scriptoriums, brewed ale, and engaged in various trades, all using the free labor of men who had surrendered any claim to compensation. The abbot and his inner circle lived in luxury, while the rank-and-file monks literally worked themselves to death. Their shortened lifespans, a direct result of malnutrition, overwork, and medical neglect. The recruitment of child oblates reveals the monastery's most predatory dimension. Boys as young as 7 were essentially sold by desperate families or donated by nobles seeking to curry favor with the church. These children had no choice in their fate, no understanding of what they were surrendering. They were systematically isolated from their families, forbidden from leaving, and subjected to a regime designed to break their will before they could develop any sense of autonomy. Many of these children died before reaching adulthood, victims of the harsh conditions and brutal discipline. The monastery's approach to knowledge was equally manipulative. While they preserved some texts, they also systematically destroyed others that challenged church doctrine or offered alternative perspectives. Monks were forbidden from reading certain works, even as they copied them. This created a bizarre situation where scribes would spend months transcribing texts they were never allowed to understand, their minds deliberately kept ignorant of the very knowledge flowing through their hands. Medical care in monasteries was deliberately primitive and punitive. Illness was seen as a manifestation of spiritual weakness or divine punishment, so treatment often consisted of increased penance rather than healing. Monks suffering from physical ailments were often subjected to additional fasting, longer prayer sessions, and more severe discipline. The infirmary was less a place of healing than a waiting room for death, where the sick were left to contemplate their supposed sins while their bodies failed. The psychological impact of this system was devastating and permanent. Even monks who somehow managed to escape found themselves completely unable to function in the outside world. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to obedience, so stripped of decision-making ability, that freedom itself became a form of torture. Many returned voluntarily to the monastery, unable to cope with the responsibility of independent thought and action. The monastery's daily routine was specifically designed to prevent any moment of genuine reflection or self-awareness. Every minute was accounted for, every activity prescribed. This wasn't efficiency, it was a deliberate strategy to prevent monks from developing any sense of personal agency or questioning their circumstances. The relentless schedule of prayer, work, and ritual created a kind of spiritual lobotomy, where critical thinking simply atrophied from disuse. Perhaps most insidiously, the monastery convinced its victims that their suffering was not only deserved, but spiritually beneficial. Monks were taught to be grateful for their misery, to see their degradation as a path to salvation. This psychological manipulation was so complete that many monks actively resisted any improvement in their conditions, viewing comfort or kindness as temptations from Satan. The social isolation was another crucial component of the monastery's control system. By cutting monks off from the outside world, the institution became their entire reality. They had no basis for comparison, no way to understand that their treatment was abnormal or cruel. The monastery became a closed universe with its own warped moral logic, where up was down and suffering was virtue. Food deprivation wasn't just about asceticism, it was a calculated method of control. Hungry people are more compliant, less likely to rebel, easier to manipulate. The monastery's meager rations kept monks in a constant state of weakness and dependency, their bodies too depleted to mount any serious resistance to the system that oppressed them. The corruption at the top levels was breathtaking in its scope and hypocrisy. While common monks lived in squalor, abbots entertained nobles in lavish feast halls, accumulated personal wealth, and often maintained families despite their vows of celibacy. The monastery operated as a feudal kingdom, with the abbot as an absolute monarch who answered to no earthly authority. This system persisted for centuries because it served the interests of the broader power structure. Monasteries provided the church with wealth, the nobility with convenient dumping grounds for unwanted sons, and society with the illusion of spiritual authority. The suffering of individual monks was simply the price of maintaining this profitable arrangement. The medieval monastery stands as one of history's most successful experiments in human subjugation, a total institution that reduced free men to broken slaves while convincing them they were blessed. The institutional web of control. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of monastic life was how these various forms of oppression interconnected to create a comprehensive system of control. The physical brutality worked hand in hand with the psychological manipulation. The enforced poverty served to reinforce the power hierarchy. The educational censorship complemented the spiritual coercion. Consider how a typical day in the monastery reinforced this web of control at every turn. The monk would wake before dawn to the harsh clanging of bells, immediately reminded of his lack of autonomy over even the most basic human rhythm of sleep and waking. The first meal of the day, if it could be called that, consisted of whatever meagre scraps the abbey deemed sufficient, served at the pleasure of the abbot's whims. During the mandatory work periods, monks laboured not for their own benefit, or even for some greater good, but to enrich the very institution that oppressed them. They copied manuscripts they were forbidden to read, tended gardens whose produce they could not enjoy, and built structures that housed their tormentors in luxury while they themselves slept on straw pallets in unheated cells. The chapel services, which punctuated the day at regular intervals, served as constant reminders of their supposed spiritual inadequacy. Every prayer was a confession of unworthiness, every hymn a celebration of their own subjugation. The very act of worship became a tool of psychological conditioning, training the monks to find meaning in their own degradation. Even the brief periods of rest were carefully monitored and controlled. Monks could not speak freely, could not express doubts or grievances, could not seek comfort in genuine human connection. The enforced silence wasn't spiritual discipline, it was a calculated method of preventing the formation of solidarity that might threaten the system. The medical care, such as it was, reinforced the monks' powerlessness over their own bodies. Illness was treated as divine punishment for spiritual failings, and the primitive remedies often caused more harm than healing. A monk who fell sick faced not compassion but suspicion, not care but judgment about his spiritual state. This systematic dehumanization was so complete that many monks began to internalize their oppression, genuinely believing that their suffering was not only justified, but holy. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their fate that they could no longer imagine any alternative existence. This psychological captivity was perhaps the most devastating aspect of monastic life, when the prisoners begin to love their chains. The monastery's economic structure further reinforced this control. While the monks produced wealth through their labor, they had no claim to the fruits of their work. Every coin earned, every crop harvested, every manuscript completed belonged entirely to the institution. The monks themselves owned nothing, controlled nothing, and had no say in how the wealth they created was used. This economic exploitation was justified through elaborate theological arguments about the virtue of poverty and the danger of material attachment. But while the monks embraced destitution, the abbots and higher clergy lived in splendor, enjoying fine foods, comfortable quarters, and political influence. The hypocrisy was stark, yet the system was so thoroughly entrenched that few dared to question it openly. The educational system within the monastery served to perpetuate these inequalities. Promising young monks were selected not for their intelligence or potential contributions to learning, but for their demonstrated submission to authority. Those who showed signs of independent thinking were quickly marginalized or subjected to intensified discipline until they learned to conform. The libraries, those supposed repositories of knowledge and learning, were carefully curated to exclude any texts that might challenge the established order. Works of philosophy that questioned religious authority, histories that revealed the corruption of the church, or scientific treatises that contradicted official doctrine were banned or destroyed. What remained was a sanitized collection designed to reinforce rather than challenge the monks' worldview. This intellectual impoverishment had devastating long-term consequences. Generations of potentially brilliant minds were stunted, their creativity crushed under the weight of enforced conformity. How many scientific discoveries were delayed? How many artistic masterpieces never created? How many philosophical insights lost forever because the monastic system demanded uniformity over excellence? The personal relationships between monks were carefully regulated to prevent any bonds that might compete with their loyalty to the institution. Friendships were discouraged, private conversations forbidden, and any sign of emotional attachment between individuals was treated as a dangerous deviation. The monks were kept isolated not just from the outside world, but from each other. This systematic destruction of human connection had profound psychological effects. Deprived of meaningful relationships, many monks developed severe mental health problems that went unrecognized and untreated. Depression, anxiety, and various forms of psychological breakdown were common, but these were interpreted as spiritual crises rather than the natural result of institutional abuse. The monastery's disciplinary system ensured that any resistance to this treatment was swiftly and brutally suppressed. Physical punishments ranged from public floggings to prolonged confinement in cramped, unheated cells. Psychological punishments included public humiliation, forced confessions of imaginary sins, and complete social isolation from the already limited monastic community. These punishments were not applied fairly or predictably, but rather at the whim of those in authority. This created an atmosphere of constant fear and uncertainty, where monks never knew what minor infraction might result in severe consequences. The arbitrary nature of the discipline was itself a form of psychological torture, keeping the monks in a state of perpetual anxiety. The cumulative effect of all these forms of control was the creation of human beings who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt as instruments of institutional will. They had been stripped of autonomy, dignity, creativity, and hope. What remained were hollow shells going through the motions of spiritual life, while their humanity slowly ebbed away. This wasn't an accident or an unintended consequence of monastic life. It was the deliberate design of a system that required complete submission to function. The monastery needed broken men, not whole ones, because whole men might question, resist, or ultimately escape. The brutality wasn't a flaw in the system, it was its essential feature. The tragedy of medieval monasticism lies not just in the suffering it inflicted on countless individuals, but in the waste of human potential it represented. These institutions, which claimed to be dedicated to the highest ideals of human spiritual development, were in reality factories for producing damaged, diminished human beings whose only purpose was to serve the power and wealth of their oppressors. The monks who emerged from this system, if they survived it at all, carried the scars of their experience for the rest of their lives. Many never recovered their capacity for independent thought, genuine emotion, or meaningful relationships. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept abuse that they often went on to perpetuate the same patterns in their interactions with others. This institutional web of control represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of human spiritual seeking. It demonstrates how easily noble ideals can be corrupted when unchecked power is concentrated in the hands of those who prioritize institutional preservation over human welfare. The systematic torment of the confessional reached into every corner of monastic existence, but perhaps nowhere was the Church's capacity for evil more perfectly realized than in its treatment of the written word itself. For in these dark halls of supposed learning, knowledge became another weapon of control, wielded with surgical precision to crush the human spirit beneath the weight of ignorance and fear. The monastery library, that supposed beacon of enlightenment in a world shrouded in darkness, was in reality nothing more than an elaborate prison for the mind. Here, rows upon rows of chained books sat like shackled prisoners, their iron restraints preventing anyone from truly accessing the wisdom contained within. The very act of chaining these volumes spoke to the fundamental paranoia that infected every aspect of monastic life. Knowledge was dangerous, the abbots understood, for an educated man might begin to question the very foundations upon which their empire of suffering was built. The process of deciding which texts would be permitted and which would be banned revealed the Church's true relationship with learning. Anything that might spark independent thought, anything that could lead a monk to question his circumstances or seek understanding beyond the narrow confines of approved doctrine, was ruthlessly suppressed. Classical works of philosophy, scientific treatises, even certain theological texts that approach Christianity from unapproved angles, all found themselves consigned to locked chambers, accessible only to the highest-ranking officials who could be trusted to use such knowledge as a tool of oppression rather than enlightenment. Brother Marcus had discovered this terrible truth during his 3rd year in the monastery. As one of the few monks who could read with genuine fluency, he had been assigned to the scriptorium, that supposed center of learning where knowledge was preserved for future generations. What he found there shattered any remaining illusions he might have harbored about the noble purpose of monastic scholarship. The vast majority of the copying work focused on endless reproductions of the same approved texts. The Rule of St. Benedict, collections of sermons designed to reinforce obedience, treatises on the inherent sinfulness of human nature, these were copied again and again in mind-numbing repetition. But it was not merely the tedious nature of the work that disturbed Marcus. It was the systematic alteration of texts that took place under the watchful eyes of the senior scribes. He watched in horror as passages that spoke of human dignity were quietly omitted from philosophical works. Sections of early Christian writings that emphasized love and compassion over punishment and submission were subtly modified. Even biblical passages underwent careful editing, with verses that might inspire hope or suggest that God's love was unconditional being replaced with harsher alternatives that emphasized divine wrath and the necessity of absolute obedience to church authority. The monks tasked with this work were told they were correcting errors, purifying the texts of heresies that had crept in over the centuries. But Marcus could see what was really happening. The church was systematically rewriting history, reshaping the very foundations of human knowledge to serve its own ends. Every book that left the scriptorium carried within it not the wisdom of the ages, but a carefully crafted poison designed to ensure that future generations would never question the absolute authority of the church. The process was insidious in its sophistication. Rather than simply banning dangerous ideas outright, which might create martyrs or spark rebellion, the church chose instead to corrupt them from within. A philosophical treatise on the nature of freedom would be copied faithfully, except for a few key passages that would be altered to suggest that true freedom could only be found in absolute submission to religious authority. A scientific work would be preserved, but with crucial observations removed or modified to ensure they could never challenge church doctrine about the nature of the world. This corruption of knowledge extended even to the most basic educational materials. Young monks learning to read were given texts that had been carefully designed to shape their understanding of the world in very specific ways. Every story, every example, every exercise reinforced the same fundamental messages. Questioning authority leads to damnation. Suffering is noble and necessary. Individual desires are inherently sinful, and the only path to salvation lies through complete surrender of one's will to the church. These were new compositions, written in the style of biblical psalms, but designed specifically to indoctrinate young monks with the proper attitudes toward their situation. One such psalm that Marcus was forced to copy read, "Blessed is the monk who finds joy in his suffering, for his tears water the garden of his soul." The psychological impact of this systematic corruption of learning was devastating. Monks who might have found solace in genuine philosophical inquiry or scientific observation were instead fed a steady diet of intellectual poison that reinforced their helplessness and dependency. They were taught to see questioning as a form of spiritual illness, curiosity as a dangerous temptation, and independent thought as a path to eternal damnation. The few texts that escaped this systematic corruption were kept under the strictest security. Marcus caught glimpses of them during his work, volumes that spoke of human dignity, of the inherent worth of the individual, of the possibility of finding meaning and purpose through reason and compassion, rather than through suffering and submission. But these books were accessible only to the highest-ranking church officials, and even then only under carefully controlled circumstances. The irony was crushing. Here, in institutions supposedly dedicated to the preservation and advancement of human knowledge, learning itself had become a tool of oppression. The very monks who spent their days copying and preserving these corrupted texts were themselves victims of the intellectual poison they were helping to spread. They had been taught to see their own ignorance as a virtue, their intellectual dependency as a form of spiritual purity. The control extended even to the physical act of writing itself. Monks were taught a specific style of script that made individual expression virtually impossible. Every letter had to conform to rigid standards. Every word had to be formed in exactly the prescribed manner. There was no room for personal flourishes, no opportunity for individual creativity. Even in the simple act of putting pen to parchment, the monk's personality was systematically erased. Brother Marcus discovered that this standardization served a deeper purpose than mere uniformity. By eliminating any trace of individual style from the copying process, the Church ensured that no monk could ever claim authorship of his work or take pride in his individual contribution. Every text that emerged from the scriptorium was anonymous, impersonal, a product of the institution rather than of any individual human being. This erasure of individual contribution served to reinforce the fundamental message that the monk himself was nothing, that his only value lay in his absolute submission to the collective will of the institution. The psychological torture extended even to the tools of learning themselves. Ink was often mixed with substances that caused painful irritation to the skin, ensuring that the very act of writing became an exercise in suffering. Quills were deliberately cut in ways that made them difficult to control, forcing the scribe to struggle with every letter. The parchment itself was often of poor quality, requiring constant attention and causing frequent errors that would result in harsh punishment. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this intellectual oppression was the way it corrupted the very concept of truth itself. Monks were taught that truth was not something to be discovered through investigation or reason, but something to be received from authority. They learned that questioning established doctrine was not a search for understanding, but an act of rebellion against God himself. The natural human desire to understand the world was systematically perverted into a source of guilt and self-doubt. The few monks who managed to maintain some spark of intellectual curiosity found themselves caught in an impossible situation. Any attempt to pursue genuine learning was met with immediate and severe punishment. But the hunger for knowledge, once awakened, could not be easily suppressed. These unfortunate souls found themselves torn between their natural human desire to understand and their terror of the consequences that would follow any attempt to satisfy that desire. Brother Marcus watched several of his fellow monks descend into madness as a result of this impossible tension. Brother Augustine, a man of naturally inquisitive mind, began to ask questions about the astronomical observations he had read in one of the approved texts. His innocent curiosity was met with such swift and brutal punishment that he never spoke again, spending his remaining years in a state of terrified silence. Brother Clement, who had dared to suggest that certain mathematical principles might have practical applications, was subjected to such intensive spiritual counseling that he emerged a broken shell of his former self, capable only of mindless repetition of approved formulas. The systematic destruction of intellectual life in the monastery served multiple purposes for the church hierarchy. It ensured that no monk would ever develop the critical thinking skills necessary to question his circumstances. It created a population of scribes who could be trusted to reproduce approved texts without the dangerous temptation to think about what they were copying. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated to the broader world that even learning itself was subject to church authority, that there was no realm of human experience that lay beyond the reach of ecclesiastical control. The corruption of education extended beyond the monastery walls as well. The few schools that existed outside the church were systematically undermined, their teachers pressured to conform to approved curricula or face charges of heresy. The church worked tirelessly to establish a monopoly on learning, ensuring that anyone who sought education would have to submit to its authority and accept its distorted version of truth. This intellectual tyranny created a culture of willful ignorance that infected every aspect of medieval society. People learned to fear knowledge itself, to see curiosity as a dangerous temptation, that could lead to damnation. They were taught that the proper response to any question was not investigation, but prayer. That the solution to any problem was not reason, but faith. That the answer to any mystery was not discovery, but submission. The long-term consequences of this systematic destruction of intellectual life were catastrophic. Entire generations grew up without ever experiencing the joy of genuine learning, without ever knowing the satisfaction of discovering truth through their own efforts. They lived their entire lives as intellectual children, dependent on authority figures to tell them what to think and how to understand the world around them. The monastery library, that supposed treasure house of human knowledge, became instead a monument to the church's power to corrupt and control even the highest achievements of human civilization. Every chained book represented not just a restriction on access to information, but a symbol of the church's determination to ensure that knowledge would serve only the purposes of oppression, never liberation. Brother Marcus eventually realized that his work in the scriptorium was not preserving knowledge, but destroying it. Not serving God, but serving a human institution that had perverted the very concept of divine truth for its own earthly purposes. The recognition filled him with a despair so profound that he began to question not just the monastery, but the entire framework of reality that had been constructed around him. The brutal landscape of medieval monasteries stretched far beyond physical deprivation and psychological torment. Deep within the stone walls of these supposedly sacred institutions, another sinister form of control festered, one that would shape the minds and souls of countless generations through the systematic manipulation of knowledge itself. The monastery libraries, those repositories of learning that modern scholars romanticize, were in reality sophisticated instruments of intellectual imprisonment. Chained libraries were aptly named, for the books were not merely secured with iron links to prevent theft. They represented the chaining of human thought itself. The heavy volumes, bound in leather and metal, remained tethered to reading desks like prisoners to their cells, accessible only to those deemed worthy by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Within these halls of supposed enlightenment, knowledge became a weapon of oppression. The monks who served as scribes were not neutral preservers of wisdom, but active participants in a grand deception. They copied texts selectively, altered passages that contradicted church doctrine, and systematically destroyed works that challenged the established order. Ancient philosophical treatises that questioned religious authority simply vanished, their ideas scrubbed from existence as thoroughly as if they had never been conceived. The process of manuscript production itself became a tool of control. Young monks spent years learning to read and write, but their literacy came with invisible shackles. They were taught to see certain ideas as heretical before they could even fully comprehend them. Their education was not enlightenment, but indoctrination, carefully crafted to produce scholars who would never truly think for themselves. Those who showed too much curiosity about forbidden texts found themselves assigned to the most menial tasks, copying the same psalms endlessly until their minds grew numb with repetition. The scriptorium, that supposed centre of learning, echoed with the scratch of quills transcribing approved thoughts, while dangerous ideas were relegated to hidden chambers or burned in secret ceremonies. The monastery's control over information extended beyond their own walls. They served as gatekeepers for all learning in their regions, determining which books could be copied, which ideas could spread, and which knowledge would be deemed safe for the faithful. Local priests depended on them for their theological education, creating a network of intellectual dependency that reinforced the church's monopoly on truth. Even the physical design of these libraries reflected their true purpose. Reading areas were positioned where senior monks could observe every scholar, every page turned, every note taken. Private study was discouraged or forbidden entirely. Knowledge was to be consumed communally, under watchful eyes that ensured no dangerous thoughts could take root in isolation. The catalogue systems, primitive as they were, served as tools of censorship. Books were organised not for ease of access, but for ease of control. Dangerous texts were scattered throughout the collection, their existence obscured by deliberately confusing organisational schemes. A work on natural philosophy might be buried among treatises on agriculture, making it nearly impossible for curious minds to piece together coherent alternative worldviews. Perhaps most insidiously, the monasteries created an artificial scarcity of knowledge. They possessed the means to produce books relatively quickly, yet they deliberately limited production to maintain their position as exclusive guardians of learning. Why allow knowledge to spread freely when its restriction granted such power over the minds of men? The monks themselves became victims of this system even as they perpetuated it. Many entered the monasteries with genuine scholarly aspirations, only to find their intellectual growth stunted by the very institution they had hoped would nurture it. They learned to practice a form of intellectual self-censorship, automatically steering their thoughts away from forbidden territories before their superiors needed to intervene. The tragedy of these chained libraries extended beyond the walls of the monasteries to encompass the broader medieval world. How many scientific discoveries were delayed by centuries because crucial texts remained locked away? How many philosophical insights were lost because they challenged the wrong authorities? The intellectual stagnation of the medieval period was not a natural phenomenon, but the deliberate result of systematic knowledge suppression. Those who dared to challenge this system faced consequences that extended far beyond physical punishment. They were subjected to intellectual exile, cut off from the very sources of learning they sought to protect. Their own writings were destroyed, their ideas attributed to more acceptable sources, their contributions to human knowledge erased as if they had never existed. The chained library thus became a perfect metaphor for the medieval monastery itself, a place where human potential was systematically constrained, where the pursuit of truth was subordinated to the maintenance of power, and where the very tools of liberation became instruments of oppression. The chains that bound the books were nothing compared to the invisible chains that bound the minds of those who read them. This intellectual tyranny created generations of monks who had learned to fear their own thoughts, to distrust their own reasoning, and to accept without question the pronouncements of their superiors. They became not scholars, but prisoners of an ideology that demanded absolute conformity, absolute obedience, and absolute surrender of their intellectual independence. The brutal efficiency of this system lay in its invisibility. Unlike physical torture, which left obvious scars, the chains of intellectual oppression bound their victims so subtly that many never realized they were imprisoned at all. They believed themselves to be learned men pursuing truth, never recognizing that they had been systematically trained to avoid the very questions that might have led them to genuine understanding. The brutal life in a medieval monastery. Part 10 of 12. But perhaps no aspect of monastic existence was more insidious than the way these institutions systematically corrupted the very souls they claimed to save. For beneath the veneer of holy purpose, medieval monasteries operated as sophisticated machines of spiritual destruction, twisting the sacred into something profane and grotesque. The confessional booth, that sacred sanctuary where monks were meant to unburden their souls, became instead a theatre of psychological torment. Abbots and senior monks wielded the sacrament of confession like a weapon, extracting the most intimate secrets from their subordinates, only to use them as tools of control and manipulation. Brothers would whisper their deepest fears, their moments of doubt, their fleeting thoughts of escape, believing they were speaking to God through his representative. Instead, they were feeding ammunition to their oppressors. These confessions were meticulously recorded, catalogued, and weaponized. A monk who confessed to questioning the abbot's authority would find himself assigned to the most brutal labor for months on end. One who admitted to missing his family would be deliberately isolated from any human contact during feast days and celebrations. The sacred seal of confession became a mockery, a cruel joke played upon men who had already surrendered everything in pursuit of divine grace. The psychological warfare extended far beyond the confessional. Monasteries employed a deliberate system of learned helplessness, ensuring that monks became utterly dependent on the institution for their very sense of identity and purpose. Brothers were forbidden from maintaining any personal possessions, even the most basic items like a comb or a spare robe. Every aspect of their existence was controlled, monitored, and regulated by the monastic hierarchy. This dependency was carefully cultivated through a process that modern psychologists would recognize as institutional conditioning. New monks were stripped of their birth names and given new ones, severing their connection to their previous identities. They were forbidden from speaking of their families, their former lives, or their dreams beyond the monastery walls. Slowly, methodically, their individual personalities were ground down until nothing remained but hollow shells programmed to serve the institution's needs. The monastery's approach to education was perhaps the most diabolical aspect of this spiritual corruption. While these institutions claimed to be centers of learning and enlightenment, they operated instead as factories of ignorance and indoctrination. The famous monastic libraries, with their chains and locks, were not protections against theft, but symbols of intellectual imprisonment. Monks were taught to read and write, but only so they could copy approved texts with mechanical precision. Critical thinking was not merely discouraged, it was treated as a form of heresy. Questions about doctrine, challenges to authority, or attempts to interpret scripture independently were met with swift and brutal punishment. The very act of learning became a form of mental slavery, where knowledge was permitted only within the narrowest possible boundaries. The scriptoriums, those quiet halls where monks labored over illuminated manuscripts, were scenes of intellectual vandalism on a massive scale. Texts that contradicted church doctrine were altered, censored, or destroyed entirely. Ancient works of philosophy, science, and literature were systematically corrupted, their original meanings twisted to serve the church's propaganda needs. Monks who discovered these alterations and dared to protest found themselves accused of pride, rebellion, and spiritual corruption. The monastic hierarchy had perfected the art of spiritual gaslighting, convincing their victims that their suffering was not only deserved, but holy. Monks who complained of hunger were told they were being blessed with the opportunity to share in Christ's suffering. Those who protested against cruel punishments were informed that their resistance proved their need for greater humility. The more a monk suffered, the more virtuous he was proclaimed to be, creating a twisted incentive structure that rewarded self-destruction and punished self-preservation. This psychological manipulation was reinforced through a carefully orchestrated system of religious theatre. The elaborate ceremonies, the haunting chants, the mystical rituals, all were designed to create an atmosphere of otherworldly significance that made questioning the system seem not just wrong, but impossible. Monks were taught that their earthly suffering was temporary, that their true reward awaited them in heaven, but only if they submitted completely to their earthly masters. The monastery's control extended even into the realm of sleep and dreams. Monks were awakened at all hours for prayer services, their sleep patterns deliberately disrupted to maintain a state of chronic exhaustion that made resistance nearly impossible. The constant fatigue, combined with malnutrition and stress, created a fog of mental confusion that the hierarchy exploited ruthlessly. Exhausted minds were more pliable, more willing to accept contradictions and absurdities as divine truth. Food became another weapon in this arsenal of control. Meals were not merely inadequate, they were strategically designed to maintain monks in a state of physical and mental weakness. The monastic diet, supposedly inspired by ascetic principles, was actually calculated to produce the precise level of malnutrition that would keep brothers compliant without killing them outright. Protein was severely restricted, vegetables were often spoiled or pest-infested, and bread was frequently made from inferior grains, mixed with sawdust or other inedible materials. The psychological impact of this chronic hunger extended far beyond physical weakness. Starving men become obsessed with food, their minds consumed with fantasies of abundance that will never come. This constant preoccupation with basic survival made higher thinking nearly impossible. Philosophy, art, genuine spiritual contemplation all became luxuries that exhausted, hungry minds could not afford. The monastery's approach to medicine and healing revealed the depths of its callous disregard for human life. While claiming to follow Christ's example of healing the sick, monastic infirmaries were often little more than places where the dying were left to suffer in isolation. Medical knowledge was deliberately suppressed, with monks forbidden from studying anatomy, experimenting with treatments, or even questioning why certain remedies failed. Instead of genuine medicine, the monastery offered only prayer and penance as cures for illness. Sick monks were told that their suffering was a test of faith, that recovery would come only through greater submission to God's will as interpreted by the abbot. Those who died were posthumously declared blessed for their faithful endurance, while those who recovered were credited with having achieved sufficient spiritual purity. This system ensured that the hierarchy could never be held accountable for medical failures, while claiming credit for any successes. The sexual repression imposed by monastic life created its own forms of psychological torture. Young men entering monasteries were expected to completely suppress their natural desires, to live as if they were already dead to the flesh. This impossible standard created a culture of shame, guilt, and self-hatred that permeated every aspect of monastic life. The obsession with sexual purity became a source of constant surveillance and suspicion. Monks were encouraged to report on each other's behavior, to watch for signs of impure thoughts or inappropriate friendships. The very human need for companionship and affection was pathologized, treated as evidence of spiritual weakness and moral corruption. This sexual repression often manifested in twisted and destructive ways. Some monks turned their frustrated desires inward, engaging in extreme forms of self-mortification that bordered on self-torture. Others became obsessed with identifying and punishing sexual sin in their brothers, channeling their own repressed urges into sadistic enforcement of monastic rules. The monastery's treatment of mental illness revealed perhaps the darkest aspect of its systematic cruelty. Monks who suffered from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other psychological disorders were not offered compassion or treatment. Instead, they were accused of spiritual weakness, demonic possession, or outright rebellion against God. The treatments for mental illness were barbaric beyond description. Depressed monks might be chained in dark cells for weeks or months, believed to be possessed by demons that needed to be starved out. Those suffering from anxiety or panic attacks were subjected to exorcisms, their terror interpreted as evidence of Satan's influence. The mentally ill became scapegoats for the monastery's failures, blamed for everything from poor harvests to outbreaks of disease. The economic exploitation that funded these institutions added another layer of corruption to the monastic system. While individual monks lived in poverty, the monasteries themselves often controlled vast wealth, accumulated through centuries of donations, inheritances, and economic manipulation. This wealth was not used to improve the lives of the monks or to genuinely serve the poor, but to maintain the power and luxury of the monastic hierarchy. Abbots lived like kings while their subordinates starved. They dined on fine foods while brothers subsisted on gruel. They wore silk robes while monks shivered in threadbare habits. They slept in comfortable chambers while brothers collapsed from exhaustion on hard stone floors. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, yet it was justified through elaborate theological arguments that portrayed the abbot's luxury as necessary for maintaining proper dignity and authority. The corruption extended to the monastery's relationships with the outside world. Rather than serving as beacons of moral guidance, these institutions often operated as centers of political intrigue and economic manipulation. Abbots sold religious offices, manipulated inheritance laws to acquire property, and used their spiritual authority to coerce donations from desperate families. The promise of prayers for the dead became a particularly lucrative form of spiritual extortion. Wealthy families were told that their deceased relatives were suffering in purgatory and that only constant prayers and generous donations could secure their release. This created a perpetual income stream for the monastery, while exploiting the grief and fear of the bereaved. The educational system that monasteries supposedly provided was itself a form of institutional fraud. While claiming to preserve and transmit knowledge, these institutions actually served as barriers to learning and intellectual progress. The curriculum was designed not to enlighten but to indoctrinate, producing graduates who were skilled in rhetoric and theology but utterly ignorant of the natural world. Students in monastic schools were taught to memorize rather than understand, to accept rather than question, to submit rather than explore. The classical texts they studied were presented through layers of religious interpretation that obscured their original meanings. Scientific inquiry was discouraged as pride. Philosophical speculation was condemned as dangerous, and artistic expression was constrained within narrow religious boundaries. The monastery's impact on the surrounding community was equally destructive. Rather than serving as sources of charity and support, these institutions often drained local resources while providing little in return. Peasant families were pressured to send their sons to monastic life, depriving agricultural communities of necessary labor while adding to the monastery's workforce. The monastic courts exercised legal authority over local populations, but this authority was used primarily to protect the monastery's interests rather than to provide justice. Peasants who challenged monastic claims to their land found themselves facing ecclesiastical tribunals designed to rubber stamp the institution's demands. Appeals to higher authorities were futile, as the entire church hierarchy was invested in maintaining the system of monastic privilege. As we examine these medieval monasteries in their full historical context, we see institutions that represented the complete perversion of their stated ideals. Rather than bringing men closer to God, they systematically destroyed human dignity and spiritual authenticity. Rather than preserving knowledge, they actively suppressed learning and critical thinking. Rather than serving the poor and needy, they exploited the vulnerable for their own benefit. The monks who emerged from these institutions were not the enlightened, spiritually developed individuals that the system claimed to produce. They were broken men, their personalities shattered by years of abuse, their minds crippled by enforced ignorance, their spirits crushed by the weight of institutional oppression. They had been transformed from human beings into instruments of an organization that valued power and control above all else. The legacy of these institutions extends far beyond the medieval period. The patterns of institutional abuse, psychological manipulation, and spiritual corruption that characterize medieval monasteries can be recognized in various forms throughout history. The techniques of control, the justifications for suffering, the systematic destruction of individual identity. These elements have appeared again and again in totalitarian movements and authoritarian institutions. Understanding the true nature of medieval monastic life provides crucial insights into how institutions can corrupt even the most noble ideals. It reminds us that claims to moral authority must always be examined skeptically. that suffering imposed by human institutions is rarely divine in origin, and that true spiritual development requires freedom, dignity, and the preservation of individual conscience. The brutal reality of medieval monasteries stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for both self-deception and the systematic oppression of others. The most sinister aspect of monastic control, however, lay not in physical punishment or even intellectual suppression, but in the systematic weaponization of human vulnerability through the sacred rite of confession. What began as a spiritual practice intended to cleanse the soul and bring peace to troubled hearts was transformed into something far more insidious, a psychological instrument of dominance that penetrated the deepest recesses of the human mind and turned men's most private thoughts into chains of bondage. Every monk, regardless of rank or years of service, was required to bare his soul completely to his confessor in regular intervals. This was not merely an opportunity for spiritual guidance, but a mandatory excavation of every secret thought, every moment of doubt, every flicker of desire or rebellion that might have crossed his mind. The confessional booth became a theatre of psychological torture where privacy died, and human dignity was systematically dismantled brick by brick. The confessors, trained in the dark arts of mental manipulation, possessed an almost supernatural ability to extract information from their penitents. They would probe relentlessly, asking questions designed to uncover not just what a monk had done, but what he had thought, what he had dreamed, what he had desired in the darkest corners of his heart. No thought was too private, no feeling too personal to escape their invasive scrutiny. Brother Thomas, a young monk who had entered the monastery with genuine faith and pure intentions, found himself trapped in this web of psychological manipulation during his weekly confession. What should have been a moment of spiritual cleansing became an ordeal of mental violation as his confessor, Father Benedict, employed every technique of emotional coercion at his disposal. "Tell me, Brother Thomas," Father Benedict would begin, his voice soft but insistent. "What thoughts occupied your mind during morning prayers yesterday?" Thomas would attempt to deflect, speaking of minor distractions or trivial concerns, but Benedict was relentless. "Come now, my son. God sees all, knows all. These evasions only compound your sin. I can sense the weight of your hidden transgressions. Tell me about your dreams. Tell me about the moments when your faith wavered." The confessor's tactics were sophisticated and brutal. He would alternate between gentle understanding and stern condemnation, creating a psychological environment where resistance became impossible. He would reference previous confessions, demonstrating his perfect memory of every weakness Thomas had ever revealed, making it clear that nothing could be hidden, and that any attempt at concealment would be detected and punished. "Last month you confessed to feeling envy toward Brother Marcus," Benedict would continue, his tone becoming more aggressive. "This month you speak of minor distractions. Do you take me for a fool, Thomas? Do you think God cannot see through your deceptions?" Under this relentless pressure, Thomas would eventually break, confessing not only to real thoughts and feelings, but often to imagined sins that he began to believe were real under the confessor's skilled manipulation. He would admit to harboring resentment, to questioning the abbot's wisdom, to feeling attraction to one of the serving women, to doubting the very foundations of his faith. But the true horror of this system was not in the extraction of these confessions. It was in how they were subsequently used. Every word spoken in the sacred privacy of the confessional was carefully recorded and catalogued by the monastery's leadership. These confessions became a comprehensive psychological profile of each monk, a detailed map of his weaknesses, fears, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited whenever necessary. The information gathered through confession was used to maintain absolute control over the monastic community. Monks who had confessed to doubts about church doctrine would find themselves assigned to the most menial and degrading tasks. Those who had admitted to anger or resentment would be subjected to additional humiliations designed to break their spirit further. The confessions became ammunition in an ongoing war against human dignity and psychological independence. More insidiously, the knowledge gained through confession was used to pit monks against one another. Father Benedict would casually mention to Brother Marcus that Thomas had confessed to envying his artistic talents, planting seeds of suspicion and destroying the possibility of genuine friendship or solidarity among the brothers. He would inform Brother Peter that Thomas had questioned his competence as a scriptorium supervisor, ensuring that natural alliances could never form that might threaten the monastery's control. The psychological impact of this system was devastating and far-reaching. Monks lived in constant fear that their most private thoughts would be turned against them, creating a state of perpetual anxiety that made independent thinking nearly impossible. They began to monitor and censor their own thoughts, engaging in a form of psychological self-mutilation that the monastery's leadership encouraged and celebrated as spiritual progress. The confessional system also created a culture of psychological dependency that was carefully cultivated by the monastery's leadership. Monks were taught that they were inherently sinful and corrupt, incapable of spiritual progress, without the constant guidance and intervention of their superiors. They were conditioned to distrust their own judgment, their own perceptions, their own moral instincts, becoming completely reliant on external authority for even the most basic decisions about right and wrong. This dependency was reinforced through a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Monks were praised for their honesty in confession, while being punished for the content of what they confessed, creating a double bind that made it impossible to maintain any sense of psychological equilibrium. They were told that their suffering was evidence of spiritual progress, while being subjected to additional torments designed to increase that suffering. The confessors themselves were products of this same system, having been broken and rebuilt according to the monastery's twisted specifications. They had learned to take pleasure in the psychological domination of their fellow human beings, viewing the extraction of confessions and the subsequent manipulation of that information as holy work that brought them closer to God. They had been so thoroughly corrupted by the system that they genuinely believed their actions were motivated by love and concern for their victims' spiritual welfare. The long-term psychological effects of this system were profound and often permanent. Monks who had been subjected to years of confessional manipulation frequently developed severe mental health problems, including chronic anxiety, depression, and what we would now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They became unable to form healthy relationships, unable to trust their own judgment, unable to experience genuine intimacy or emotional connection with other human beings. Many monks began to experience what could only be described as a complete fragmentation of their sense of self. Years of having their most private thoughts extracted, analyzed, and weaponized against them left them uncertain about their own identity, their own desires, their own beliefs. They became hollow shells, going through the motions of religious observance while having lost any genuine connection to their own spiritual lives. The monastery's use of confession as a tool of psychological control represented perhaps the most profound violation of human dignity in the entire monastic system. It took something sacred, the human need for spiritual guidance and absolution, and perverted it into an instrument of oppression that reached into the very core of a person's being and systematically destroyed their capacity for autonomous thought and feeling. This psychological terrorism was justified through sophisticated theological arguments that portrayed the destruction of individual will and identity as necessary steps in the journey towards spiritual enlightenment. Monks were taught that their resistance to this process was evidence of their pride and spiritual immaturity. that true holiness required the complete abandonment of any claim to psychological privacy or independence. The confessional system also served to identify potential troublemakers before they could pose any real threat to the monastery's authority. Monks who expressed doubts about the system, who questioned the legitimacy of their superiors, or who showed signs of independent thinking, were quickly identified and subjected to intensified psychological pressure designed to break their resistance before it could spread to others. In this way, the monastery created a self-perpetuating cycle of psychological oppression that ensured its own survival and growth. Each generation of monks was more thoroughly broken than the last, more completely dependent on the system that oppressed them, more incapable of imagining or creating alternatives to their situation. The confessional became not just a tool of control, but a factory for producing the kind of psychologically damaged individuals who would go on to perpetuate and expand the system that had destroyed them. The true genius of this system lay in its ability to make its victims complicit in their own oppression. Monks came to believe that their psychological destruction was actually spiritual progress, that their loss of autonomy was evidence of their growing holiness, that their inability to think independently was a sign that they were becoming more like Christ. They learned to take pride in their own degradation and to view any impulse towards psychological health or independence as evidence of their continuing sinfulness. So as we've seen, life within the stone walls of a medieval monastery was indeed brutal in its own unique way, defined not by the sword or plough, but by rigid discipline, harsh physical deprivation, and the constant struggle between earthly suffering and spiritual salvation. These monks and nuns endured freezing cells, meagre rations, and punishing schedules of prayer and labour, all in pursuit of divine grace in an unforgiving world. Yet perhaps their greatest trial was not the cold or hunger, but the psychological torment of reconciling their human nature with impossible spiritual ideals. Though we may never fully comprehend the depths of their sacrifice, we can honour their memory by recognizing that even in the most sacred of places, medieval life demanded a price that few today could bear.